The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on setting up a project for IFC collaboration. We'll wait for a couple of more people to join in, so we should be starting in about 1 minute or so. Just a quick reminder, feel free to subscribe to all the next webinars of the series. We'll have a QR code on the screen that you can point out with the camera with your phone, and that should help you out with the subscription right away. Other than that, we're pretty much ready to go. And today's session will be basically focusing on answering questions and clarifying some of the concepts we covered on the session 3 or part 3 of our webinar series. Okay, so without any further delay, let's start with today's presentation. So again, my name is Nando Mogollon. I'm a digital design consultant with Central Innovation. I am an architect and a BIM manager, and I have roughly 19-20 years of experience in a few different countries. As I promised, you can use that website on the screen, or you can point your phone on the phone camera on the QR code on the screen. That should take you straight away into that website where you can subscribe so you don't miss any of the future webinars on the series. So last session, we did cover a few points, most of them trying to make sure that your model exchanges, your export of IFC files were consistent and regular across the life cycle of the design project, right? So for that, we were discussing basically 3 points. We had a short chat clarifying the differences between the file formats. So that will be IFC, IFC zip, or IFC XML. So we went through that fairly quickly. We did clarify a couple of the differences across them. We don't really have any questions, but if you guys have any questions right now, feel free to ask them right away. We also had a short chat over how to set up the publisher so that you will always export the same type of files instead of you having to remember how did you set that up in the first time. So that is fairly easy to be done with the publisher, same way that you publish all your DWGs and PDFs in printed drawings. And we took a look at the dedicated translators, focusing on the schema that translator was going to use in the MVD. But we also took a look at the other presets that also define what kind of IFC you're going to have as a result of the export. So to clarify a few of the issues, we didn't have too many questions, so I ended up having a discussion with someone else on the team and gathering a couple of the questions that it might be worth clarifying from the last session, probably because they were not clear enough or because there is information behind it that is not evident or self-evident when we did the presentation. So first one is mostly a concept rather than some tricky bit that you do with Archicad. And this bit is referred as to the reference files or what the reference files are. So there are, when we use the word reference, we're basically talking about a couple of different things. We're talking about part of information that is not really part of the federated model. Basically, they may not represent the final building or the design of the building per se, not a thing you can touch, not a thing you can cost on the building, but they may be used as information that will help you put together the project itself. So those can be used as guides. Think of location, maybe the context, maybe a model analysis for transit, for weather, for wind, for anything like that, that could be produced for the product information model, the project information model, and you may need that for reference. Reference in this way, it's referred to be basically a guide that you can look at, but you basically are not going to operate directly on that. On the other side, you have reference as part of the federated model. In that case, it is mostly related to linked files or interconnected files that, when put together, actually represent the digital version of the building. That is typical common elements with other disciplines, columns, plumbing fixtures, but also, specific in-scope disciplines. So the doors and windows for architecture, and the finishes and the ceilings and so on. So in the second point that we want to clarify will be on the publisher. Now, for that one point, we're going to jump into Archicad. So I'm going to come back to this because first I want to clarify this concept of the use of reference files any further. So the concept itself can be found, is not being defined by, it's not the first time that it's being used, but you can find a reference to that in the context of the ISO standards for information exchange. In this case, 19650. I actually have a typo there. It's not 59, it's 50. In point 9, information contained based for the collaborative work, you'll find that point 8 actually refers to that as the production of the information should have access to outsource or to source information from others. So not self-produced models or drawings in that case, or anything else, but let's talk about models right now. And you can source any of that as a way of reference, federation, or direct information exchange. In that case, that is referred there as to be part of the information that you gather, although may not be absolutely needed for your own scope of works. It can also be found on the second part of the ISO standard. Again, mind you of the typo there, it's not 659, it's 650-2. And in -2, in the part 2 of the same ISO standard, on point 5.1.6, it actually explicitly talks about the type of information that you may need when you are talking about reference information as a guide. In this particular case, point B, it talks about shared resources, this point here, in which case those shared resources can refer to container templates, 2D or 3D geometrical models or documents, as it is the case of the project location with the grid lines and the cuboids, but it could be also context, it could be a model or a 2D reference drawing for context or any type of analysis. All of that is part of the same concept of having reference models other than the pure federated model. Okay, so if we have that clarified already, and again, it's not a concept that we have invented, not a concept that I came up with at all. That's all been taken from all the documents. In this case, all I want to do is put that particular term in the context of the most current ISO standard that may apply for the subject. All right, for point 2, that is the IFC setup for the publishers, then we actually need to jump into Archicad. And we want to take a look at 2 different things. The views or viewpoints that you use, either Floorplan or 3D, and the dedicated translators. So that may require a little bit of clarification, and let's go ahead and jump into that. So you may remember the building we've been putting together. That's this multiple story thing. We've got 20 stories on that. And that one, yes, that one building, it's been produced roughly to a very basic level, something like schematic or so. So we don't have too much information, but we're going to use it for the sake of exchanging these files in IFC format with the other participants. So when it comes to having a regular and consistent output, you want to make sure that the model content and its settings, it's always consistent, or always, if not absolutely the same, pretty close to be much of the same. It will be evolving in terms of the maturity of the design and the level of detail and information that's embedded into it. And all of that should be already set up, or most of it should be already set up within your publishers, and then your views, and then the project. How do you get to that? Well, let's start by using the organizer, which will be probably the best way to have enough working space for this. And like anything else, just as a reminder, I've got a publisher right there at the end that's been already set for publishing all of my IFCs. You might as well have one per IFC type, but I'd rather have one for all of them, since I want them to be grouped all in once. And inside there, I have created a shortcut using this button here from my view map, where I also have a dedicated folder to drop all the views that I'll use for that IFC export. So from this folder, I will be storing and producing the information that I will share with others in IFC format. What do I choose from the publisher, and what settings do I choose from the view? From the publisher, you have the right or the ability to set the file type. That's where you go from IFC or IFC XML, or the zip versions of those two files. And you can do so by choosing one for all the files inside, or you can modify and set something different from any of the individual files inside the folder. In our case, we're using all of them to be IFC simply. The schema and the MVD do not depend on the file format per se, since these will only write the structure of the file in a particular way, and it will give it a file extension. To control the schema, that is IFC 2x3, IFC 4, and so on, you need to jump into the translators. That's why the second option in this part of the publisher actually explicitly tells you which translator is being used. And you can, from this point of view, select different translators for different files, which is exactly what I've done based on that concept of having dedicated translators, which is something I need to clarify as well in a couple of minutes. So I've got individual selections for translators. All of them are using a pure and flat IFC file, not compressed, not in XML, pure IFC. And the translators I have different from each. These translators can be checked but cannot be modified from this list. If you want to modify them, you have to go through a different menu, but you can select different ones from this view here. And you have seen that I've created a bunch of them for each and one of them. There's nothing else you can change in here in terms of the content of the file other than the naming convention of the file. Now, for the naming convention, you can type your own if you want to have it customized, or if you want to have a rule that actually derives the naming convention based on a particular rule or auto text, you can do so by using these options here. Now, that might not be the topic of this webinar, but there is a way to do that. If you don't know exactly how to do that, feel free to ask the question, you know, through the questions panel on this thing, and we can sort that out, or we can come to that on one of the next webinars. But that, out of subject, but it is easy to be done. So that will bring me files that with a specific naming convention, and naming convention is one of the things you have to pay attention when exchanging files. For the content itself, other than filtering things in and out and explicitly write the geometry in one or other particular way with the translator, which we'll take a look at in a second again, The only other thing that you can use to filter in and out will be the contents of these views. And that will be referring to how you have the setup of every single view. For instance, for that project location and so on, I actually have, let me minimize this. I have a specific layer combination that I'll use just for that, not a custom one, a specific layer combination that I can control and I can keep up to date. Also have a specific structural display, which in this case is displaying the entire model and nothing else. That will control the extent of what part of the models I can see or not see, basically dismissing finishes and any layers in between. You can also exclude things by applying a renovation filter. In this particular case, if you're using it as it's intended from the out of the box, it will be excluding either things that you will be demolishing or things that are existing, or simply the new things. So depending on how you want to apply that, renovation filter will help you filtering out at the level of the view. If you're using design options together with the renovation filter, also can be done. Same principle applies. It will depend on which renovation filter are you using. All right, other than the view sets, there's still a few of the things that you can filter out, and those will be set not from the settings of the view, but simply by the zooming and which kind of zoom was saved with it. So in this particular case, you'll see that those views, let me double check. Yeah, they don't have any specific zoom because they were saved as axonometric view probably with no cutting planes. Now, if you do so, there are only a couple of things you need to know. I'm just going to close this for a second and come back to this. On a 3D view, you may have included a specific layer combination, but you still can trick the 3D view to filter out certain things by using the elements in 3D view and filter and cut 3D elements option. With this option, you can actually exclude certain element types by their type. Okay, so from here, I can easily go and say, do not display the curtain wall, and then curtain walls won't be displayed. If I save this in this particular way, the IFC that will be a result of this, even though I'm not excluding the layer, I'm not excluding the IFC type from the translator, I'm only excluding it from the 3D view with that filter. The output of this particular view will result in a model that doesn't contain any curtain wall tools. Okay, so that's another way for you to filter things out, which is based on that particular filter. Note something else that is not quite evident. You may think that by adding cutting planes like so and having this in that particular way, displaying your 3D view in that particular way will affect the export. Cutting planes do not affect the content of the exported IFC. They only cut the model for visualization, but they don't split the model through there if that was the case. So that won't help doing so because the IFC still writes everything that it's contained by the file, even if it's been cut by the cutting plane. Right? So beyond that, then all you have is basically the same 3D file. Let me reset this and yeah, there you go. All right, so the exercise that I did was essentially exporting the IFCs from a 3D view and from an axonometric view. There's no magic to that. It could be just as easily have been a perspective view, and the file will be exported just the same. So that's nothing but a visualization thing. So it doesn't affect the IFC at all. The one thing that will affect the way the IFC gets exported is the source of those particular views. So I'm just going to go back to a plan view like so. And display just this flat ground floor in here. You can also export an IFC from a plan view itself. So if you decide to save that, I'm just going to save it like so. You will see that if I jump back to the publisher, that it's also being included as to be part of the IFC output. And you will be able to export that, and it will export the entire project. It will ignore what is visible and what is not, because now it's assuming that you want to export the entirety of the project. In IFC now, you should change the naming convention just to fit it with the rest of the project. But that's basically what is going to change. You lose some of the availability of filtering things in and out from the screen, but you will be able to include additional things. For instance, one of the things that I've noticed, and I still need to run a couple of tests, which is something that it only occurred to me when I was reading the question lately, is that when you use translators that are explicitly trying to export 2D information, that 2D information that I have here, for instance, will be set on your translator on the model filter preset. So your model filter preset right there at the end will have the ability to export lines, text, labels, and fields only. So, not fancier 2D elements. But it will also export the symbolic views of doors and windows whenever they happen. There's certain things that are not exported. The most critical one so far that I've found will be it's not exporting the symbolic lines and text of your stair elements, and those might be necessary. So it's not doing that just yet. Hopefully we'll get that sorted soon. But it's capable of exporting a minimum of things. When do you use these options? You use these options when you know that there's going to be a transfer of the file that will be read in another BIM software like an authoring tool like Revit or Vectorworks or Allplan or EcoSim or similar. And then if the translation is done correctly on their side as well, it's to be said, they also will have access to some of the lines, text, and labels. It is very good when you're labeling things like doors and windows, for instance. Then those labels will be displayed on their side. Mind you, dimensions do not come across, and it's mostly for symbolic annotation or tags that might be useful. One clarification needs to be said, it's not even good practice to rely on IFC to do that. I've found text playing a role on that because there's no guarantee that the font will be exactly the same on the other side. So text sometimes moves around, and the content of the field might not be exactly the same for the same reason. Field definition doesn't really translate fairly well, or not exactly the same as you wish it would. But it does a relatively good job with the symbolic lines for doors and windows, and a very good job for the grid lines that are transmitted in the file. So these options, when you have them on, will be included in the file when you export the file, using the same translator, the same preset, and so on. But then when they export it from the plan view, like so. I've got that fairly recently, so I don't really have a file to show you with that. But next session, I'll spend a couple of minutes to explain or to show and display, one file where the IFC has transferred 2D drafting lines and text and fields. So just for you to see how that looks like. For everything else, that's pretty much the same. Please remember to keep your publisher up to date simply by making sure that the settings, let me go back to here, the publishing properties are not changed. If you start changing these on the fly, then the resulting, the outcome of that might not be the same, so you end up having files in different locations. Right now, I'm using Archicad 23, so I have access to save these files in IFC format. There is a project from Building Smart where hopefully, if things go well, by the end of the year or sometime next year early on, you should be able to export directly to a file sharing system, part of the CDE system of the project, and then choose something like upload to Aconex or upload to a site or BIM 360 or anything like that if that project comes through right. But so far you export locally, and then from that local export you will share your files to whoever will need the files. All right, so that's pretty much everything I needed to show you today. Don't really have many more questions there. Oh, it's an example of the filtering based on the structural display, just in case. General model, site and context, and the project location for reference. So that's the one we were talking about, reference as an aid or a guide. And hopefully the publisher thing was clarified. There are certain things you set up at the publisher level, and there are certain other things you need to set up at the view map level. Okay. All right. So these are the points we covered. The use of reference files, setting up the publisher, views and viewpoints, and dedicated translator. Maybe the dedicated translator requires an extra bit of information that I have missed. The question that I've got was on the topic of what do you exactly mean by a dedicated translator? And I think it's better explained by looking at this listing here. Archicad out of the box comes with a series of translators that have been preset so to get you started beyond the line of having to build everything from your own, knowing that certain tools and certain settings will be predefined relatively easy. For instance, IFC4 for both MVDs, the design transfer view and the reference view, they have very typical setups, so you can use some of that as your starting point. But these are not really mandatory, nor are a good fit for absolutely every single case. So when I mention that you should, or that is good practice to have dedicated translators, what I basically mean is that if your BIM execution plan or your simple agreement with the other parties says that you guys are going to start exchanging files in IFC, flat format, not zip, not XML, and that the schema will be IFC4, or the language of the IFC will be IFC4, not 2x3, and that the model view definition or the relationship in between the elements inside the file will be a reference view or a design transfer view. Then you can use those as the base to build your translator per either discipline or per case. In my case, you see here that I have really have 4 different IFCs that I'm outputting from my file. One is a reference file for the location and coordinates. I have a reference file as a site and context, and I have the coordination files for architectural and the one that I use for the load-bearing elements with my structural engineer. All of these have dedicated translators, as you can see up here. And the reason why I want to have that is because if I mess up with this translator here and its settings, I know that I'm not affecting any of the other translations, right? And that is done by creating a new translator, giving it a name, hopefully a description if you have the time, and making sure that the presets are also dedicated, or that they're not shared or not modifying any of the presets of the existing ones or the other ones you're using for different purposes. So it is good practice, more than mandatory or anything else, that you use dedicated translators or presets whenever you're modifying the presets that are coming from with software. Why you want to do that? Simply to keep everything else as it was, so that you can reuse them if in need later in the project. That's all that it is. It is very likely that you will create a data conversion specifically set up for specific uses, because data is the kind of thing that can bloat a file, can make it larger than it needs to be. So you can control that from the presets. Other than that, you simply end up having multiple additional translators. They don't make the file bigger, or they don't affect, and they don't affect performance. So that's what we meant with dedicated translators. Let's click OK. So if that's good enough and you guys have no further questions, then we can call it a day. Thank you for coming in. Remember, you can get help directly from our support team at that email there on the screen, both in Australia and New Zealand. For engineering inquiries, commercial questions, and so on, you can get access to those by sending an email to customer success at centralinnovation.com, or give us a call in that support hotline there on the screen, both in Australia and in New Zealand. Thank you very much for attending today, and we'll please make sure that you register and check the rest of the content. These videos will be recorded and it will be there on the screen. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for next week webinar in the series, where we will going to be discussing the next portion of all of this, which is exchanging files. So no more setting up a file, but rather exchanging files. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.